Got some good ones this morning, don't we? So I think some of you know parts of this story. Some of you have never heard it, but I'm going to try to tell it in its entirety this morning. And it goes right to the heart of blessings and woes. So if you heard a little bit of it, bear with me, please. It was customary, you might say, Sunday mornings in the church where I grew up, that you would find children lining up along the center aisle of the pews, like right by each one of those little ends there, like miniature racehorses. Each one of us kids were eager, you see, to be the first to grab someone's hand in the recessional. And in so doing, could be the first out the door and into the parish hall before the postlude even started. The coveted hand, of course, was the priest's, right? Because that gave you at least a 10-second head start if you got lucky. There was more to coffee hour in those days than Oreo cookies, burnt Maxwell House, and the Thin Mints that you need right after that just to talk to someone. I have it on good authority that pimento cheese and gallons of sweet tea is served in heaven alongside massive amounts of fried chicken. And nothing to this day on Sundays says church more to me than a bucket of KFC. And if that's not an invitation to be an acolyte and to be in the altar party, I don't know what is, Daisy. My father was a deacon, and though he was certainly in this procession on the way out, that didn't necessarily grant me or give me a way out, right? I had to earn that hand just like everybody else in the congregation. I had lost out on several occasions, having to leave the nave just like everyone else, right? And so I was thinking about how I might reverse my fortune. And so a breakthrough came right after Christmas, and it occurred to me that after communion, and I can't do it in this church, well, maybe I can. After communion, I could use my status, right, as the deacon's son, to go in and check up on everyone who sat in the front pew. Give them a little hug. Ask them how they're doing. And maybe, just maybe, sit down right next to them and get into a conversation. Right, Sally? Yeah. And do it just long enough, right, that I'd be caught there. So when the priest got up and started to say the post-communion prayer, I had to stay where I was. Because we don't move when the priest is praying, right? We all have our assigned seats. That's a no-no. And so that worked one morning. I sat next to the Hibbards, Shirley and Bob. And as the priest began to say the post-communion prayer, I looked back and I saw my friends Paul and Mark in the way back. And they were beside themselves because they knew that somehow I had gotten a front row seat without having to show up early. It's good. And so when the organist began to play the first chord, the heavens opened up, and in front of me, I knew that I had won the day because as Father Mike came out, he extended his hand to me, I took it, and we were off. As we reached the narthex, which is kind of the same way that St. Luke's is set out in the back there, we rounded the back pews, and we had to come to the front because some people left over there and some people left in the back. And as I was doing that, I looked behind me again and saw that Paul had grabbed my dad's hand. And that was so delicious, right? Because I knew by the order of liturgical precedence that meant he had to stay with my dad until he dismissed the congregation, and that gave me all the more time to be first in line. As the descant soared and the sopranos took over, the winds changed, and in through the front door of the church came the likes of a man that I had never seen before. Hidden amidst a jacket stuffed with newspapers was the first time in my life that the term poor became associated with a person. Big brown boots carried this man's limp, and as I backed away from that, Father Mike leaned in and asked the man a very simple question. How can I help you? Tears welled up in the man's eyes. I think he wasn't expecting that. I think he was expecting to be turned away. But I'll never forget what he said, or asked, rather. He said, "I am so hungry. Can you make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?" It was the first time that I saw a man cry. In response to his request, Father Mike opened wide his arms. And the man came forward and buried his head in his chest. And Father Mike's arms wrapped around him. And with his head over the man's shoulder, he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, "Nick, wait right here. Wait till your dad gets up to the front of the church. We're going to the kitchen." That morning's victory was shattered. I looked into the church, and they must have been on verse 10 of whatever hymn they were singing, because I remember having enough time to watch where they were going and then look back and see where Paul was, and to make up my mind that I had three choices. I could stay there, I could follow them, or I could be first in line. For an 8-year-old, it's very tempting, right? But I knew something had changed, so I walked cautiously against the wall down the hallway. And just as I reached the kitchen, Paul, in his glee, ran behind me and slapped my head and said, "I win." But I was fixed. I couldn't leave where I was. For in that moment, I saw Father Mike, still in his Eucharistic vestments, his chasuble, take the bread from the cupboard and make this man a sandwich. And when he finished and he put the food in front of the man, instead of going and taking off his robes and leaving him to eat in peace, he sat down beside him. And he put his hand on the back of the man's head and stayed there while he ate. I wish I could tell you how he ate that sandwich. I think more went on his face than in his mouth because both of them were crying. And I've thought a lot about this moment this week, and there was something that I wasn't able to hold then, but I've been able to hold now. And that's that in an instant, that weeping turned into laughing. And what I've come to realize was a mixture of sadness and love in a Eucharist for two. And there has been no doubt in my mind that after saying Chrysostom's prayer for so long now, that Jesus was right there in the middle of them. For when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, that's where I'll be. In the years that followed, folks have often asked me about the moment I wanted to become a priest. And I've been tempted to say to them that it was then. But I was too little, right? I was too little to know what that meant that day. Instead, I've come to think about this moment in my life as the day that I learned what compassion was. And how the simplest of things hold for us both blessing and woe. These two are never really that far away from each other if you think about it. I've thought about this moment as one of blessing in my life, and it certainly is. But until now, have never really stopped to consider the woes that were present then. The blessing is right before us. The poor man, his hunger sated, and his tears of sadness turning into joy when he was touched by a stranger. But what are you and I to make of the woes of an 8-year-old? Not the priest before you, or the priest then, or even the old man. But the boy, who saw a vision of what the church has always meant to be. He's long gone now, but I still experience sadness when I see him in my memory. A man unnamed, whose presence reminds me ever of the consolation I experienced before I knew what loss was, or what the blessing of fullness felt like, despite never having known disappointment. A child's contentment before the pressing faults of guilt sure is an interesting place to engage with the woes that we carry as adults, don't you think? Ever focused on what is before us sometimes, I think we forget that the child within and the child before us in this memory is not damned, as we are quick to do to ourselves when we age. Rather, blessings and woes seen through the eyes of youth. As bread is given, love extended, and humanity restored, shape for us a very different pair. And a space, I think, where compassion meets conviction. Which, if we think about, are never really that far away from each other either. The coupling of these forces, my friends, often leads to the great reversals hoped for in the kingdom of God. The ones sung about by Mary, preached by Jesus, and done by us. Sandwiches are just the beginning.